The claim that RCTs are rigorous, I think one reason it's misleading is that RCT can only be as rigorous as the researcher.
There have been delays in wage payments, but then they go on to say this is a great success because it has reduced corruption.
And this is a problem I have with this entire movement. Same here with NREGA, the Employment Guarantee Act. If we had been asked to produce RCT type evidence at that time in favor of that employment program, we would not have been able to show much.
Can you give me like one or two examples where RCTs have really worked very well and people have benefited from that intervention?
It's not easy to.
Hello and welcome to InFocus. I'm G. Sampath. Evidence-based policy, randomized control trials or RCTs, these are buzzwords in developmental policy these days. They have become almost synonymous with each other. The evidence in evidence-based has come to mean whatever data is produced by one method of research, which are RCTs these days. But as some economists have been trying to tell us, RCTs have their limitations. Regardless of whether it is RCTs or some other research methodology, is it wise to let so-called evidence be the sole arbiter of public policy? What are the ways in which evidence-based approaches can go wrong, and how have RCTs ended up being misused, resulting in actual harm? We are joined today by eminent economist Professor Jean Drèze. John, welcome to InFocus. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you coming to Delhi, to the Hindu office for this conversation. So I want to start by asking you, by quoting what you had written in one of your essays. You had said, once upon a time, evidence was widely confused with randomized controlled trials or RCTs. So what exactly are RCTs and how do you think this confusion happened?
Okay, so an RCT is basically a technique. It's a technique to evaluate the outcome of an intervention. Intervention could be a new seed, it could be a new drug, it could be a new method of teaching children, it could be a new payment system for NREGA workers, all kinds of things. And the basic point is that the way it works is that the subjects of the experiments, who could be people, they could be villages, they could be plots of land, whatever, are assigned randomly to two groups. One is the control group where there's no intervention, and the other is the treatment group where the intervention takes place. And then you look at the outcomes. And the idea is that if the two groups are selected randomly, then the presumption is that they are likely to be similar, if not identical, in most important respects. And so if you find a difference in the outcome, it must be because of the intervention. That's the story. Okay? So it sounds like a very simple and powerful technique, and sometimes it is. But actually there are a lot of difficulties and issues with it. Let me give a couple of examples. Let's start with an example of a relatively unproblematic RCT. Suppose that you want to find out whether sending reminders by SMS to taxpayers around the end of the financial year improves tax compliance. Okay? I don't know how interesting the question is, but let's say that's what you want to do. So you could take a random sample of, let's say, 5,000 taxpayers in Delhi for the control group, no intervention, another 5,000 taxpayers again in Delhi, and you send them these SMSs, and then you try to find out whether the tax compliance is higher in the treatment group than in the control group. And if you want, you can go further. You can divide the treatment group into two subgroups, one where they get friendly SMS, one where they get threatening SMS, to find out whether it works better to send them friendly or threatening SMS and so on. So I think this is a case where it could work. I don't know how interesting the results will be, but I think it's something you could consider doing, and not particularly harmful. I mean, the subjects are taxpayers, powerful people, so I don't see any serious objection to this sort of experiment. Let's look at another simple example. Suppose you have come up with a new variety of rice seed and you want to find out if it's more productive than the traditional varieties. So let's say we're looking at a village of 1,000 farmers. Each of them has a plot of land. Now let's first think of how normally the new seed would come into this village. So what would happen is that the more educated and better off farmers would hear about the new seed, they might take interest, they might try it out on a small plot of land, and then people will observe each other. They may discuss how these different seeds are doing. They may reason, they may read books, a process of informal learning. In Palampur, where I lived in UP in the 80s, they call this dekhi dekha, mutual observation. We try to figure out where things are going. And of course, gupshup, we talk with each other. So it's a form of folk learning, if you like. And that's how they acquire a certain amount of knowledge. Very valid way of learning. Now, suppose Randomista comes in. Randomista is the nickname for these RCT enthusiasts, and it's not a disparaging nickname, by the way. I mean, it's a friendly nickname. I have many friends myself among these Randomistas, even when we have disagreements. So anyway, Randomista comes along and he says, no, let's do this scientifically. So what we'll do is we'll select 50 plots at random for the control, 50 plots at random for the treatment. Treatment is the new seed. So we'll start the new seed in these 50 treatment plots, and then we'll see which seed is more productive, which sounds again like a great way of going about it. But if you think a little more, you can see that there are going to be a number of issues. For example, the farmers who are part of the treatment group may feel nervous because it's a new seed. The reason you're doing an experiment is that you don't really know how good that seed is. If you knew it, you wouldn't need the experiment. So they're taking a bit of a risk. Now, are you going to do it with their consent? If some of them don't consent and withdraw, then it's not a random sample anymore. That's one set of issues. Other issues. Suppose that this new seed turns out to be more productive. Now, why is it more productive? The experiment in itself doesn't tell you much about that. It may be that it's a better seed. There could be other reasons. It may be, for example, that the local birds don't like the new seeds, so they go for the old seed, and the new seed they don't eat, and that gives a productivity advantage to the new seed. It could be that the farmers had compassion for the researcher who came from so far away and is putting so much effort in this experiment, and he needs to get something out of it. So maybe the farmers in the treatment group thought, "Chalo, we'll make an extra effort to make it work." There could be many different reasons. And these RCTs are not very good at telling you why things are the way they are. They'll just tell you the difference in the outcomes. Then there are other issues. I mean, suppose that this new seed works well on average, but some of these farmers in the treatment group actually lose, maybe because the slope of their plot or the quality of the soil of their plot is not suitable for that new seed. So there are some losers. Now, what happens to these losers? Are you going to compensate them and so on? So there are technical names for all these issues I'm mentioning, like spillover effects, Hawthorne effect, and so on. And then very important is this whole issue of external validity. That suppose it worked in that particular village in that particular year. Does it mean that it's going to work the next year or in another village? Maybe not. Maybe the next year there'll be a drought, and maybe your new seed is not drought resistant. Okay, if you want to deal with that, and if you want to claim some kind of general superiority of the new seed, then you may have to repeat the experiment in a different year, in a different village, and then it becomes very cumbersome and expensive. It becomes a bit like drinking soup with a fork. A lot of effort for very little result. Okay, so the point I'm getting at is that now this is one way of learning. But it's not necessarily superior to that folk learning, like, this dekhi dekha and gupshup. It's one way of learning. And of course, it's not mutually exclusive. I mean, we can do one as well as the other. But it would be wrong to think of RCT as a superior way of learning, even if you accept, which is not necessarily true, that it's a more scientific form of evidence. I mean, that is a contested claim. But even if you accept that claim, it doesn't mean that it's a better way of learning, because there are different ways of learning. Now, coming back to the statement you have quoted, it's a slightly exaggerated statement, and I mentioned that in the paragraph where this sentence appears. But what I was drawing attention to is that there was a time, and I think that time to some extent is gone. I think the RCT movement has improved, and I think has been corrected by its critics. I think there's less fanaticism today than there was. But there was a phase of fanaticism where the RCTs were thought of as some kind of golden standard of evidence, and there was a tendency to devalue other types of evidence, like this learning that happens through, dekhi dekha and gupshup and so on and so forth. And I think that's a big mistake, because all evidence matters. Evidence is a big thing; it's a very general thing. There are many different sources of evidence, and there's a kind of paradox of evidence that if you set the bar very high, and if you only recognize what's above that bar and you don't really value the rest, then you end up having very little evidence because, you're depriving yourself of a lot of evidence. So I think today we have a more balanced view of all these issues and a better understanding of when RCTs are appropriate, what are the issues that they raise, what are the pitfalls and the dangers, including a lot of ethical issues, which we could also discuss.
So this, thank you for that very detailed sort of setting the frame for our discussion going forward, Jean. So these RCTs, are they basically from economics, or have they been imported into economic research from some other field? Where did this RCT as a method of research originate? Which field is it from?
I think it came mainly from medicine.
Medicine.
And the need to understand the effectiveness of new drugs. You can understand why, for example, the agencies that are approving drugs want very solid evidence that the drugs are effective, and they want to know about the side effects and so on and so forth. And in that context, RCTs can be quite useful. But in the medical context, the ethical safeguards are very strong. They're very strict ethical protocols. And I think that when this method was extended to new fields, including, for example, development economics, some of these ethical norms became much weaker. In fact, in the economics, I think the ethical safeguards, although there are some safeguards, there are some ethical norms. But
what do you mean by ethical norms in
for
economics?
Example, I'll just tell you the two simplest one. One is informed consent, but we know that this is often symbolic. If it's possible at all. There are experiments where it's not even possible because the subjects are thousands of people dispersed over large areas.
No, in the medical context, this informed consent is, one understands why it's so important, because if you could die or you could have a serious,
but you could also die from some of the RCTs that have been done in development economics can have quite
like, for example, you mentioned the tax. I mean, somebody might not pay tax after getting an SMS. That's not such a big.
That's not a case like that. But when you do experiments to dealing with things like education, health, nutrition, and so on, then there could be harmful consequences. And that's the second basic principle after informed consent, that you should not harm anybody. But in practice, you can easily find examples of experiments where people have been harmed or where there was no real consent and so on. So I feel that the ethical safeguards are far too weak in development economics.
So speaking of the second principle, you should cause no harm. I was going through your pieces on RCTs, and you speak about the Bihar experiment, where you are transferring the Narega payments from whatever the traditional method of payments to an electronic method. Yes. I think BETS, and there please correct me if I'm wrong. It's done by the main RCT big guns, Esther Duflo and Banerjee and so on. So that when they started to do this RCT, this research, the objective was to see if this electronic mode of payment would enhance the use of Narega. More funds are used or not. Okay, and then they do it. And then at the end of it, they find that actually it has gone down. Okay. And number one. Number two, there have been delays in wage payments, which is actually a classical example of harm. Okay. But then they go on to say this is a great success because it has reduced corruption. No, in an RCT, can you just shift the goalpost? Your original goalpost was, is it increasing spending or not? Okay, it is not. Now you're saying it has reduced corruption. How does that fit in with an economic method of research that you are shifting the whole thing? Is that normal? I'm just trying to understand. Is it part of ours?
So to be fair to them, I don't think they quite claimed it was a grand success, but they certainly said, I don't think they acknowledged that it was actually a failure. And it was a failure because, aside from the issues that you have mentioned, the experiment had to be discontinued after a few months because it had created so much chaos and there was so much opposition to it from all kinds of people in Bihar. So, and a lot of this, I feel, was predictable. I mean, if you described this new system to an average Narega worker, I think they would have probably said immediately, wait a minute, what's going to happen to the timeliness of wage payment? So I think there was a kind of predictable failure. But anyway, the point is that I feel the honest thing to do would have been to say, okay, this was an intervention that didn't really work. It was premature, the groundwork, because it was rolled out in a big hurry. That was one reason why it didn't work. So I think it's a case where it would have been better to say, okay, let's learn from this. This is not an appropriate intervention. It was done too hastily. The groundwork had not been done. Maybe the system that we were trying to put in place is not even the right one in any case. But the thing is that, there's a lot of pressure in these experiments to come up with positive results. And this is a problem I have with this entire movement, that on the one hand, the USP of this RCT movement is a claim to rigor and objectivity, that, we go by the facts, and it's a very scientific method. But on the other hand, you operate in an ecosystem where there is a lot of pressure to arrive at certain results, and it's very easy to be swayed by that and to tweak results so that you end up with something that you can more easily publish, or that you can more easily present to the funders so that you can get a follow-up grant or whatever. So in a way, is it really serious? I mean, to have this kind of claim of objectivity in that kind of ecosystem? I'm not very sure. So in that case, they didn't quite say it was a grand success, but they didn't admit, I think, that it was.
Regardless of what they may have said, but in the larger perspective, it is perceived as a success.
Yes, and here I want to add one more point, which relates to what I've just said, which is that there are actually two things in this. One is the academic version, where there is a lot of rigor and a lot of qualifications, and where they did mention, only in passing, but they did mention the delays in payments. And then there's a kind of dissemination account, which is for the wider public. And that's where there's a lot of spinning, because, if you want to be successful in that field, you have to promote yourself, you have to promote your experiments, you have to show that you found results, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not casting doubt on the integrity of these researchers, or let alone their skills. I mean, they're very able people, and I'm not saying that there's any dishonesty involved. But I'm saying that in that ecosystem, it's very easy to lean one way or the other, and to be selective, and to end up giving an impression that doesn't really correspond to what actually happened.
No, see, nobody is sort of pointing fingers at RCTs per se. As you said, it originated in medicine. Brilliant idea to have RCTs in medicine to bring out new drugs. You want to say, try out one new cancer drug. Great. But I want to hear from you. Can you give me like one or two examples where RCTs in developmental sector, in social policy, have really worked very well and people have benefited from that intervention?
It's not easy to think of such examples. I can think of examples where that's the claim, but until you look at the details, you can't always be sure that that is true. I can't easily think of many RCTs which are technically sound, plus ethically acceptable, plus useful and interesting. I can think of one example right now. I'm sure there are some, but
you're sure there are some? I'm asking an economist, developmental economist here, to give me one example where RCTs have really worked well in social policy, and you're saying I can't think of a single one.
Oh, I'm sure I have not read that many RCTs. To be frank, I have read some RCTs in great detail because I was very curious about them, including this Bihar experiment. And that for me was a bit of a shock, because these were supposed to be some of the best RCTs. And then when you actually go into the details, you find that it's much more shaky than it appears. So, but I have not read hundreds of RCTs, and so I can't easily give that kind of example, but I'm sure there are some. RCT is a technique. We cannot object to the technique per se.
No, nobody's objecting to technique. Using this technique in policy making, that is a discussion. In policy making, you're using this technique.
Okay, so policy, you say, RCT is one thing. RCT is about evidence. Policy is a different thing. I think evidence is a scientific matter. It's about the facts. Policy is a political thing. You have to have certain values, choices, priorities, and you have to have a process. You have to have a process of deliberation about the policy. And that's why I don't like this term evidence-based policy, because it gives the impression that policy can be based on evidence alone. And there was a time in that fanatic phase where some claims were made pretty close to that. The idea was that we have to find out what works. That was the buzzword. We have to find out what works. And the implication was that if we find something that works, then it will be worth doing. Now, it's not like that. I mean, first of all, what works depends on the objective. Then you have to think about what the objective, whose objective, what objective. And secondly, if you have found evidence of something that works in terms of well-defined objectives, it doesn't necessarily mean that it should be translated in policy. I think what it means is that that evidence can inform policy. But that's not the same thing as to say that policy can be derived from the evidence itself. Many papers in economics end with a section called policy implications, partly because the researchers would like to think that, their research will feed into something. Why not? But very often these so-called policy implications don't follow from what preceded. And there's a reason for that, policy doesn't follow from facts per se. You need to think about what are you trying to do, what your priorities are, what your values are. You have to think about the trade-offs. So evidence-based policy, it should be evidence-informed policy. I'm also in favor of evidence-informed policy. But I'm wary of people who think that evidence leads by itself to policy implications, because mostly it's not like that. Even the simplest policies involve a very charged political environment. I mean, think of these eggs in midday meals. We've been advocating eggs in midday meals for a long time. It's a kind of surefire intervention. There's actually, so far as I know, there's no evidence of an RCT kind in India that eggs are good for children in midday meals. But we have good reason to think that. I mean, there's nutrition science and so on, and there are precedents in other countries. So we can be, without an RCT, we can be, I feel pretty sure that this is a good policy to advocate. But the moment you advocate that policy, you get into a very charged environment where you have to face these upper caste vegetarian lobbies who are opposing eggs. You have to face the vegans who are opposing eggs, and then the resistance of the finance.
So would it be fair to say that suppose there is an RCT on this, whether eggs in midday meals, are they generating better nutritional outcomes for children or not? And then you have a treatment group, a control group, and then the RCT experiment says it is better. Then evidence-based policy would dictate that across the country you roll it out. Would it still be accepted?
So I think there are 2 points here. One is, I would be uncomfortable about the RCT because you would be giving eggs to some children and not others on a random basis. Okay, when actually the need of the children, if you're not going to give it to everybody, then the requirement of equity is that you should give the eggs to the more undernourished children. But you are doing it randomly for the sake of your experiment. I think that requires a strong justification. Sometimes there may be a justification, but without a strong justification, I would be uncomfortable about this way of using children as guinea pigs. That's one thing. The second thing is that if the RCT shows nutrition effects, now again, there may be also other effects, both positive and negative, so in itself it doesn't necessarily tell us what to do. But where do you go from there? Does it mean that you can advise the government to go for eggs? Well, it's not so clear. Suppose that if they go for eggs, they are going to lose the next election because the upper caste vegetarians are going to ditch the ruling party. Do you still advise them or not? Well, you have to make up your mind, and that takes you into a different territory. That's not evidence. That's political engagement. That's engaging in the process of policy making, which is by nature of a political and ideally a democratic process. I think many of these randomistas are actually thinking, and sometimes even saying, that this is what we want to do. We want to depoliticize the process. We want to keep away from that noisy democratic engagement, and we want to have rigorous evidence and then sit across the table with the policymakers and advise them based on that evidence. I think that's quite dangerous, really. And I speak partly from experience because, every profession has its biases, and so do economists. And if you want to make a recommendation related to midday meals, for example, then you should be part of a deliberation that also includes nutritionists, vegans for that matter, policymakers, and so on. If you just solo try to push, for a policy of a certain kind, then there's a risk that things will go wrong.
No, you just mentioned a very interesting thing, Jean. You said evidence-based policy making coming from economists who have done RCT kind of experiment and so on. They are comfortable, or they want to depoliticize the process of coming up with policy making.
And you can understand sometimes.
Yeah, and
I'll give you an extreme. One of them said years ago that no significant new policy should be put in place within 2 years of elections, 2 years before election. because they feel that at election time, there's this politicians try to get votes and that distorts policy. I'm not so sure, because actually that is the only time when poor people get something. It's the only time when politicians remember them and make promises. And sometimes maybe these promises are exaggerated and so on. So there's an issue. But to say that no policy within 2 years of election, that will deprive the poor of the only little bargaining power.
What if we flip it and say no policy before 2 months before the election?
2 months before the election, in any case, may not be possible because of the code of conduct.
No, it's possible. We know, we have seen in recent times. That's a different question. So this entire tendency to depoliticize policy making, because we don't want all the chaos and the confusion of different lobbies, interest groups, etc. We just go by pure scientific method of whatever the experiment and evidence is giving us. We will follow that. Now, isn't that the same as what the entire neoliberal framework of economic policy making seeks to do? Because they say let the technocrats, let the experts decide. Why do you want to go and involve ordinary citizens, peoples and activist groups and all in policy making? Scientists and experts, they know exactly what is going on and they will decide. So is the entire evidence-based policy making agenda, or the RCT agenda, is it also in a way pushing forward the neoliberal way of making policy?
Before I come to the last question, just clarifying once again what I'm trying to say, that I feel economists have to make a choice. Either if you want to restrict yourself to the science and produce evidence to inform policy, whether through RCTs or other methods, that is one thing. That is fine. I have no objection at all to that. If you want to get into policy making, policy advice and so on, then I think you have to go further and you have to be willing to associate with people who are working for change, who are involved in this democratic process of policy making, and you become part of that democratic effort. You can choose to do that. Some people will do it, some people won't. If you just want to restrict yourself to the science, that's fine with me. But I'm saying don't think that within the realm of science you can enter that policy making space. Now, you have raised an important question about the affinity, I would say, between what you call the neoliberal agenda and this RCT movement. And I think there is some kind of connection. Firstly, because the funding agencies, they love these apolitical techniques. Okay, and that's one reason why the RCT movement has flourished so much, because they got so much funding from these funding agencies, very often connected with IT companies and so on. And so again, here there's a possible source of bias. And the other part is that if you go along with this idea that, which at some stage some people were advocating, that policies should be restricted to things that have been vindicated by some kind of RCT or something approaching an RCT. Some people at some point were saying that. I think maybe not today, but there was a time when this kind of advice was given. Then by nature, this is going to restrict social policy, right? Because if you can only do things that are demonstrated by an RCT, then, I mean, think of the National Health Service in the UK. If Nye Bevan, who was basically the driving force behind that, if he had been told that, first show us an RCT and then we'll create the National Health Service, nothing would have happened. Yes. And same here with NREGA, the Employment Guarantee Act. If we had been asked to produce RCT type evidence at that time in favor of that employment program, we would not have been able to show much. So the RCT movement and the insistence.
So in fact, this takes my case further. I asked you to give me an example of an RCT which has, proven to be, leading to a good policy. Now, we are finding that you spoke about NREGA and various other legal NHS and so on. I'm trying to think of whether these policies and these schemes would have even come into place if they had been subjected to the entire RCT framework. It's not only, it's like going the other way. They may have really not come through because they were all outcomes of political mobilization, not evidence-based policy. There was no evidence, for instance, that the Right to Education Act is going to be a great thing.
Yes, but I don't think many people, certainly today, would insist that we need an RCT before we do a policy. I don't think so. By the way, since you had asked for an example of a productive RCT, One example, I think, could be that famous RCT in Kenya about deworming of children. The deworming of school children improves their school attendance and so on. I think that was pretty solid for that particular area. So I think that's a case where, at least for that area, they had found something that actually has.
But isn't that common sense? Do we need to really do an experiment to sort of figure out the deworming will be better rather than not deworming?
So the point I was coming to is that, unfortunately, that has not always proved replicable, because there are places where children don't have worms. You don't need to deworm them. So I think the effort that was made after that experiment to extend deworming to the whole world, it was called actually Deworm the World. That was not vindicated by subsequent evidence. But at least for that area at that time, that would be an example where you can actually do something for children based on an RCT.
Right. So yeah, this goes back to the point you made earlier about, if an RCT seems to validate an intervention in a particular area, it's not necessarily scalable to other places at all. You need to do another RCT wherever else you want to do it.
So that's called the external validity problem.
Right.
There's a lot of technical literature on all these problems I mentioned. The Hawthorne effect, spillover effects, external validity, and so on. But you don't need to read that technical literature to understand that RCTs are more problematic than they sound, number one. And number two, which is the point I began with, and I'll end on that, which is that it's one way of learning and there are others, and it's not necessarily a superior way of learning.
You mentioned earlier that economists have two ways they could go. One is they stick to producing scientific, knowledge through their experiment, and they are functioning as academics. That is fine. The second is when you want to get into impacting policy or influencing policy, you could work with people at the level of people as citizens.
Citizen with expertise in economics, which can be very useful.
Yeah.
But recognizing that there are other people in that process, and including, by the way, the affected people. Right. Yeah, so not just the so-called experts.
Yes, and
so these are two different roles, and one has to choose.
Yeah, even the second role, to some extent, one can understand it could have a good impact. But there's a third dimension here, where you are measuring your policy impact in terms of how you are able to directly deal with the state, not the people, but the state, the policy makers, the bureaucrats, the ministers, and so on. That is where I think you would say it's becoming dangerous, because then the people are getting bypassed. Would you agree with that?
I think you're referring to what I call these embedded experiments.
Yeah, you could be embedded, but even without experiments being involved, you might be, as an economist who has done that, be able to enjoy the kind of access to policy-making spaces which the people on the ground may not have. In that sense, you are influencing policy. And the reason I'm asking this question is, when you say that economists have to be cautious about getting into policy space, in principle, it sounds great, but in reality, we find that many economic researchers are under pressure to show policy impact as a condition for getting grants for their research. But that's the reality. Like, how do you navigate that space if you're not going to be, obsessed with policy impact?
It's not exactly a condition for getting a grant, but it helps to get a grant. This is what I'm saying, that there are nudges.
Okay, nudge. Okay, nudge for you, yes.
To use another famous buzzword.
Yes.
I think the only answer is intellectual honesty, and that's what actually rigor is all about. This word rigor, which I don't like so much, and the claim that RCTs are rigorous. I think one reason it's misleading is that RCT can only be as rigorous as the researcher. If you're a bad researcher, if you're dishonest, if you tweak things, you can make an absolute mishmash of an RCT. So the RCT in itself is not a guarantee of rigor. It can be rigorous if you, the researcher, are honest and objective, and you are not swayed by these nudges or whatever other influences.
One RCT which has happened recently, this is something which I was following a little bit in the education sector in Andhra Pradesh. I think Michael Kramer has been involved, and this is about giving tablets to students, those who are not doing so well in classrooms. So this experiment found that those who were given tabs and which these are tablets which would sort of teach the children according to their learning level. So they found that those children who got this, did better compared to those who didn't get. But these results didn't really show too much in the exams. But in terms of their learning outcome, there was clearly a difference. Now, my question is, does this mean that we're going to start distributing tablets to these children?
No, hopefully not. I mean, hopefully it will inform the whole debate, but many educationists don't like these technologies, so they must be part of the debate for sure. This example relates to a point I was trying to make earlier about the ecosystem and the funding and so on. I mentioned in passing that a lot of the funding comes from tech companies, directly or indirectly, not directly typically, but quite often indirectly. And one reason is that they are quite interested in innovations, and RCTs is a way of testing and sometimes promoting innovations. And that's another source in this ecosystem of biases, that if a lot of the work is funded by tech companies who are interested in positive results of their... I'm not saying that the company that's promoting that technology is the same company that's funding the RCT. It's not as simple as that. It's more like an ecosystem. Yeah. So if you operate in this ecosystem where there's a lot of dependence on directly or indirectly on tech companies, then obviously there is a pressure to come up with findings that support that kind of technology. I'm not at all saying that this is what Michael Kramer has done. I would like to see what he has done. It's only by going through the details that you can make up your mind whether this is credible or not. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of time to read these RCTs. Some of them are very, very complicated and very technical, and not everyone can afford the luxury of reading them. So when we hear the results, in the form of an abstract or in the form of a newspaper headline, we're not always sure what to make of them. That's part of the problem.
No. See, I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert on how you do these experiments. But as someone who covers social affairs, education is clearly in that domain. What I felt when reading about this intervention is that if you say the problem is some students' learning outcomes are poor. Okay. Now you want to fix that. Now, what are the different ways you can fix it? Maybe better teachers, something happening outside school. So you look at various things and then you try to look for different solutions and you try them out. Is the poor learning outcome the starting point for this RCT experiment, or is the starting point the fact, what if tablets can help? So your starting point is innovation and technology. It's not the problem you're trying to solve. So that, I feel, sort of drives the entire agenda in a very different way from trying to solve a particular problem. I don't know if I'm able to convey.
I don't know. We can't read the minds of these researchers, so we can't tell what drives them. But I think that at least in that JPAL circle, I think there were people who were genuinely concerned about the learning achievements of children. They saw these Pratham reports where we find that children in class 5 can't learn and read and write and so on, and so they became very focused on that. So I don't necessarily question their motivation. But it's true that it's very focused on these measurable learning scores and test scores and so on. And that's only a very small part of what education is about. And that's why sometimes these educationists react adversely to the policy advice that comes out of these experiments, because it's really very focused on the test scores. So that comes back to the need to take that evidence, or so-called evidence, into a larger domain of deliberation and democratic engagement, and of involving educationists, teachers for that matter, and contribute to that process with the skills and evidence that we have. But not like you described. I mean, if the outcome of the experiments you're talking about were to be that the government of Andhra Pradesh,
yeah.
That straight away starts adopting these tablets or whatever it is in all the schools, I would be quite concerned about that.
Right. My last question, Jean, before we wrap up, can you talk a little bit about what your phrase, the long bridge between evidence and policy? I think that's a note on which...
Okay, so we've already beaten around that bush a little bit implicitly. But the point I was making is that evidence is one thing, policy is another. Evidence is a scientific activity, or it's about the facts. Policy is more like a political, democratic process, or it should be democratic at least. Now, what is there in between? I think there are 2 or 3 things. One is understanding, which is not the same as evidence. Evidence can help understanding, but evidence can come from many different sources. It can come from evidence. It can come from experience, which is extremely important. That Nai Bhavan, who had no evidence for his National Health Service, he had very important experience. He had siblings who had died of TB or something because they couldn't get healthcare. So he had a conviction that no, we want every citizen to have free healthcare. Yeah. So experience can be a very important source of understanding. Reasoning is an important source of understanding. Dialogue is an important source of understanding. So evidence is one thing, understanding is something more. Then we need values. We need to think of what are we trying to achieve and for whom. That's not a matter of evidence, right? And lastly, most importantly, as I've already discussed, we need the credible democratic deliberation process.
Right. I think evidence, with this long bridge of understanding, reasoning, dialogue, deliberative, democratic process, then will reach you to a policy that actually is something everybody, I think, would see value in it. Thank you so much, Jean.
Thank you.
That's all I have for you in this conversation. Pleasure talking to you.